The Arizona State Museum is a museum of archaeology and ethnology for the larger southwestern region of our country, of our state, and our nation. One of the goals of this symposium is to bring together perspectives of scholars and practitioners, Native American and non-Native, for a stimulating dialogue on the issues of creation, interpretation, and use of photography of American Indians and Alaska Natives across time. I have enjoyed being part of this dialogue in my personal association with filmmakers, museum professionals, historians, writers, and fellow Native Americans on offering viewpoints on the corpus of Edward S. Curtis's photography. I would like to thank my colleague, Dr. Doug Nickel, Director of the Center for Creative Photography, for his generous co-sponsorship of this symposium and for granting use of this beautiful and, I would say, very well-equipped auditorium. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Lisa Falk, Assistant Curator of Education. Lisa is a member of the museum faculty and provided the leadership role in organizing viewpoints, Native Americans, and photography.
We have a number of sessions, and I decided to keep introductions to each session short so that we could have more time for our speakers. In your program are biographies of each speaker, so we will just give you the title of the session and mention who the speakers are, and their introductions are really in your program. Our first session today is Issues of Documentation and Interpretation in the Past, Today, and the Future. And we're honored to have with us Lucy Lippard, who is a well-known art critic and writer about contemporary society, as well as she's well known for writing about photographs and partial recall, one of her books. Jim Ferris, who is an anthropologist who's written a lot about photography of the Navajo. And with us also is Alita Ringlero, who is an independent scholar as well as an art consultant. She buys art for some of the casinos, especially Casino Arizona locally. And she'll be talking about some of her research on photography of Pima women. And Monty Russell, who is a Navajo photographer and educator, who was the first Navajo newspaper journalist. So that is our next panel, and their order of the speakers, if they don't know, is in the program. So Lucy, you're first.
I titled this talk Image Wars, because ever since it was invented, photography has been a weapon in many different wars of representation, not least the struggle of indigenous people to guard the images and meanings of their own cultures. Lakota scholar Vine Deloria calls early 20th century photography a weapon in the final skirmishes of cultural warfare, in which the natives of North America could finally be properly embedded in their places in the cultural evolutionary incline. As Indian people struggle on all levels to be recognized as active subjects rather than passive objects in the ongoing history of this country, photographs play a significant role. The pictures here on the left is it dark enough for those pictures? Could be darker. I've got a light, if anybody can hear me. The one on the left is Catherine Smith with a rifle she used to resist relocation at Big Mountain. And the photograph is by Sam Bingham. The one on the right is photographed by Jolene Rickard, who's Tuscarora. It's called I See Red in '92. Contemporary photographers are still using photographs as weapons, but now they're in control of their own images, often appropriating the stereotypical weapon in order to turn it around. Imagine if the sharecroppers had photographed Walker Evans, suggests Tuscarora Mohawk photographer and writer Rick Hill, or if they could have been paid to photograph themselves. Does it take a city boy to interpret farmers, a white photographer to interpret the life of a black ghetto? The one on the left is by Joe Cantrell, who is Cherokee. It's called Grandmother Laughing. The one on the right is Tom Jones, who's Ho-Chunk Choka, his grandfather, watching Oprah. Still, old habits die hard. Non-native photographers, especially in the Southwest, continue to make a good living photographing Indians for a market that continues to thrive. So I'm going to show mostly work by Native Americans like these. In 1992, I wrote and edited a book followed by an exhibition called Partial Recall, Photographs of Native North Americans, which I didn't realize, I'm so used to nobody ever having seen the book, I didn't realize you were using it here. So there's going to be some of it in here. I'm going to talk a little about its process because I think it illustrates some of the ongoing issues of photographic cross-culturalism. Partial recall was an attempt to recognize the reciprocity of the photographic process of looking at history through images, knowing it isn't easy to divest ourselves of the treasured cliches harbored by Euro-American culture about Native Americans. That thing at the left, which decidedly phallic object, is in fact the unveiling of a monument to Chief Ouray and Chipeta, his wife. I don't know what date that was, it looks like the 20s. And the one on the right is by H.S. Pauley from 1894, and it's a totally posed picture called Youth Indians at Play. The actors are even identified, they know who most of these people were, including the African-American guy on the floor there. Historical pictures bring back a storm of colonial emotions, which have to be sorted out from more progressive responses. Vine Deloria says, one must probe very deeply in the recesses of today's psyche to see the subtle tones of racism in the perpetual fascination of white Americans for portraits of Indians. And it's not only non-natives who are fascinated. Raina Green, the Cherokee curator at the Smithsonian's Museum of American History, has said, I have to hate old photographs, not for what they do, but for what they make us do. Not all of us, not just Indians. I hate these photographs for what they make us wish for. End quote. Similarly, Rick Hill, advocating, quote, art confrontation rather than military confrontation, that's a step forward, says, we should quit trying to be something we are not. We celebrate distorted images of our past. Partial recall was inspired by a photograph that was sent to me from Canada by Gerald McMaster, the Plains Cree painter and curator, who eventually contributed an essay to the book. Samson Beaver, his wife Leah, and daughter Frances Louise, Western Canadian Assiniboines or Stoneys, were photographed on a September day in 1907 by the American explorer and artist Mary Schaefer, and that's them on the left, obviously. The Beavers' relaxed poses and friendly, unselfish, unself-conscious expressions might be those of a contemporary snapshot, like the Kathleen Westcott photograph at the right. She's a Anishinaabe. It's called Amy White Man Runs Him, Braiding Her Hair. The Beavers have been freed from that patronizing frame that freezes personal and social specifics into generalization and is usually described from a neutral and anonymous third-person perspective. The Beavers are present because of their impressive personal presence, yet absence is also a major component of this relationship with an image. That's where the title partial recall came from. Somehow the time and cultural space that usually distances us from historic representations of another is lessened here. The portrait is only secondarily quaint, despite the inevitably picturesque veneer from the passage of time and the interval implied by the dress of almost a century ago. Given the scarcity of such relaxed images, Schaefer's photograph is a microcosmic triumph for social equality as expressed through representation. The discontinuity and disjunctiveness that usually characterize cross-cultural experience are translated here into a certain harmony or the illusion thereof. The Beaver's portrait seems like a classic visualization of what anthropologists have called intersubjective time. It commemorates a reciprocal moment rather than a cannibalistic one, a moment in which subject and object are caught in exchange within shared time, rather than shouting across history from their respective peaks. The enculturated distance between photographer and photograph, between white and native, has somehow been momentarily bridged to such an extent that the bridge extends over time to us, to me. Unlike flat death, which is how Roland Barthes described photography, the Beaver family seems embodied and full of life. The one on the left is by Horace Pula, who's Kiowa. It's called Kowain Onte and great grandson Jerry Pula. And on the right is by Rick Hill. It's called The Flowered Path on the Way to My Brother's Funeral. One of my favorite definitions of photography is by Hopi photographer Victor Masayevsky, who, by the way, refused to be in partial recall, rightly exercising his control over his own work. He wrote, photography is a philosophical sketching that makes it possible to define and then to understand our ignorance. Photography reveals to me how it is that life and death can be so indissolubly one. It reveals the falseness of maintaining these opposites as separate. Photography is an affirmation of opposites. The negative contains the positive. And from another angle, Rick Hill has pointed out that the contemporary native photographer has to watch out not to, quote, overact to the negative images and oversimplify the positives. Native photographers have to be careful to protect the trust shared by their people, a trust that the images will not fall into the abuses of the past. At the same time, they have a responsibility to reflect on the realities of native lifestyle. The challenge to native artists will be to go beyond documentary photography and find more creative ways to express the aspects of tradition, culture, spirit, and social realities of their people, end quote, which is what the photographers here are doing in this symposium. I was aware that writing about a white woman, Mary Schaefer, photographing native people, the Beavers, was a kind of metaphor for my own position as an Anglo critic trying to write about contemporary native North American art. In a previous book called Mixed Blessings, I'd insisted on white people's need to surrender the right to represent everybody, the colonial overview. So while I was conceiving partial recall, I realized I'd better practice what I preached and make this book a place where native people could speak for themselves. I asked 12 native writers and artists who come from a place I can't speak from and say things I can't know, to write about a single photo each, any photo that they found and selected themselves. And to my surprise, only Gail Tremblay chose a contemporary or native photographer to discuss, and that was Juliet Sinajni's Matty looking searches for Steve Biko, I think is the title of that. That was the picture she chose. And Jolene Rickard on the right made her own montage. That's her grandmother. It's called Skawure, the bird that carries the language back to another. Yeah, and then Suzanne, now we have a chance to look at that. And then Suzanne Vanelli on the left and Joy Harjo on the right both wrote about family images from their own families. That's the Marcy Harjo and family on the right and Vanelli family portrait on the left. And the others all used historical pictures, which I thought was kind of interesting. Maybe we can talk about later. I was trying to find images that would challenge the stereotypes of both the fascinators and the fascinated, photographs of equal and active interaction between native people and Euro people. It was a lot harder than I thought it would be. I looked at thousands of historical pictures in 4 states and found very few alternatives to that cliche. It's an eerie experience to go through the photographic archives, file after file of dusty file of pictures of people like ghosts deprived of rest. Nevertheless, the dehumanizing process of portrait photography as mere inventory is undermined by the irreducible presence of a self. The one on the left is one of the few sort of equal exchanges, but it can't be an equal exchange because it's an anthropologist, Alanson B. Skinner, and, quote, a Cree informant, who is nameless, of course. And on the right is the Joseph Dixon's marvelous portrait of Ishi, which Gerald Visner wrote about in the book, which is one of the, again, a very rare image of someone who they were trying to make fun of him, but he won. Any demythologizing process courts disillusionment as a byproduct, which is a good thing, since illusions of any kind of perfection, like mobility or stoicism or pantheistic connectedness or authenticity, are all obstacles to political freedom for the subjects. A feminist reading recognizes in the historical representation of Native people the myth of paternalist protection as a barrier to autonomy, the pedestal and gutter syndrome, in which those who are threatening or denigrated are placed beyond the pale, above it all or below it all. At the same time, there's considerable dignity and resistance in these pictures, which must not be mistaken for dime store nobility and torn away with the colonial packaging, like this picture of Ishi. Tuscarora Jolene Rickard, whose photo's on the left, describes self-portraiture in this denigrating historical context as trying to see your face in a shattered mirror. The only defense the turn-of-the-century sitter had against misrepresentation, aside from outright refusal, was the expression on his or her face. A certain amount of stiffness and impassivity can be attributed to the long exposures, but I wonder if some of the supposedly stoic look, the passive squaw and stone-faced chief cliches, were not voluntary defenses against yet another intrusion. Perhaps these were the best weapons at hand in those days when the ultimate weapon, the camera, was always in other hands. The native subjects could not, after all, just stick their tongues out. Rudeness in native cultures is ideally confined to the area of clowning and humor, which could and can be brutally honest. And these are Cossack clowns at San Juan Pueblo on the right around 1940, taken by T. Harmon Pankhurst. He says they were clowning for the camera, but I have a feeling they were clowning at him. Contemporary artist, Diné artist Colette Simagini often does stick her tongue out. In the 1994 installation called Photographic Memoirs of an Aboriginal Savant, 15 images with texts on general issues such as education, land, borders, stereotypes, she pulls no punches. You have time to read that? Can you read that? One on the left, you probably all know also, is by James Luna, Take a Picture with a Real Indian. And on the right, Dorothy Granboy's, who's Chippewa, though Luna is Diegeno Luceño, Dorothy Granboy's Diary of a Teen Mother. The spaces occupied by Native photographers even today are not precisely the same as those in the dominant culture, though they certainly overlap. And it's still necessary to insist that Native artists are every bit as modern or postmodern as anybody living in the U.S. today, or at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. But contemporary Native life has to include daily resistance to the imagined Indian that seeped from the past into the present, and historical images are frequently incorporated into new work. Most contemporary artists blithely dismiss history in favor of innovation, the planned obsolescence of the avant-garde. But Native artists, like it or not, must confront and correct blindered images of the past and at the same time maintain valued tradition. These are both by Zig Jackson, who'll probably show you a lot more, who's Mandan Arikara Gatsa. One on the left from the Degradation series, and one on the right from Indian Photographing Tourist Photographing Indian series, which I show in practically every lecture I give, it seems like. Tourism interferes, and that's another long story I won't get into. As Levi-Strauss has pointed out, the notion of travel is thoroughly corrupted by power, often made possible by bribery and deception. Many pictures were also propaganda, taken not only to record supposedly vanishing indigenous cultures, but also to grease the ways of assimilation and so-called progress. Around the turn of the century, Indians were seen as objects, the photographic counterparts of today's scenic overlooks, ready-made views, a frame for the lazy to see through. They were often considered as part of nature rather than culture, and endowed with qualities of the awe-inspiring lens they were losing. Not much has changed. Just a few years ago, a traveling photo show called The Lens and the Landscape featured on its poster not a landscape, but a formal portrait of a native man. Maleka Lula calls this colonized approach of a vivisector's gaze. Much that Lula has written about Orientalism and the colonial harem in his book of that name is all too easily transposed to photography of American Indians. He calls the postcard ground zero of photography and the fertilizer of the colonial vision, and points out how the ethnographic alibi leads to manipulative violence and restores a pacified reality. I don't actually know the source of that thing on the right. We can look at thousands of these images without realizing that Native people were not pacified, and they did fight back. The one on the left is by Donald Kadzau. I haven't got a date on it. Called Mission Slave Girl Washing, with no mention of the fact that she's trying to push the photographer away. And the one on the right is a George L. Beeman, I guess. Beeman, photograph of a Taos Pueblo dance, and the guy at the left is giving the photographer hell, too. When young Alfred Bailey was doing field work in Alaska in 1919, he asked a Tlingit fisherman to pose for a picture. And Bailey writes, he curtly refused, and when asked why, he said, "You want to put it on a postcard and laugh at me." End of quote. The devoted, if sometimes misguided and mendacious photographer Edward Curtis was yelled at, attacked with mud, rocks, and clubs in the process of creating his monumental life work. When William Henry Jackson tried to photograph a group of Utes, he replied, "They would snatch the cloth from my head or toss a blanket over the camera or kick out one of the supporting legs." In 1926, a busload of tourists at Santo Domingo Pueblo, who'd been warned they couldn't photograph the dances, jumped out and started snapping. Without a sound, wrote a witness, Indians poured out of every doorway, all carrying clubs. And before they could get on the bus, there was a general smashing of cameras. These are both by Melanie Yazzie-Diné, who teaches here. The one on the left is called She Teaches Me. It was an installation piece in Santa Fe about her grandmother. And the one on the right is called Indian Symbols. The Pueblo writer Teresa Harlem says that Native artists are set apart by their shared reliance upon a Native contextual framework. In the hands of non-European cultures, the picture is often valued for what it portrays to those who are familiar with the subject. It loses its modernist identity as a self-conscious image, its postmodernist identity as a shifting reflection, and works in relation to another value system. Context is all important to how we see and understand photographs, but context is usually out of reach. Place is an integral part of these images, even when there's no evident landscape component, even when there's no there, since many of these locations are unrecorded and lost to us. If the late 20th century Euro-Americans' perception of place is almost irreconcilably different from that of indigenous peoples, it's also necessary to acknowledge the history of the places we live in and the identity of our early hosts, those on whom the parasitical settlers first depended for survival, as Cheyenne artist Edgar Hiegelberts has pointed out in his public artwork called Hosts, which I seem to have forgotten what the slide is. Contemporary Native American artists often consciously reverse the colonial images. In 1992, 3 Navajo students at the University of Colorado in Boulder made an installation that literally reversed the relationship between background and foreground. 3 Little Indians, I'm missing one over there on the left, by Melanie Yazzie, Laura Shirley, and Ken Yazzie, presents crudely touristic cutout facades of Navajos modeled on a conventional sort of pop-through backdrop. They were displayed with an array of stereotypical Indian pictures and imitations of roadside signs like those that are all along the landscape near Gallup. But behind the backdrop is the place the subjects really live. Translucent photographic self-portraits are overlaid on the delicate tracery of the mapped land in which they're rooted. The backdrop is reality. What meets the eye first is fake. The layered or coded approach of many Native photographers to images of themselves is a strategy to reveal only as much as the viewer can understand. The challenge for non-Native viewers is to become informed, writes Teresa Harlem. The "you are here" spot on the map has shifted suddenly to a new and unknown location. That's Edward Curtis on the left and Carm Littleturtle on the right. Hers is called Raymaker, and his was Curtis's idea of what San Ildefonso people were doing when they were asking for rain. So the image wars continue, but with fresh interpretations from Native people. New windows can be opened. In an awkward collaboration, we're all constantly reinventing these pictures. Although it's agreed that a photograph cannot tell a complete truth and is often used to tell lies, there's always at least a grain of truth in a moment that did take place. And it's against that grain that we must test our eyesight. That's it.